The first speaker that we have from DG Research and Innovation is Hélène Chraye, the head of unit from Clean Energy Transition, who is joining us by phone. Hélène, would you like to take the floor?
Okay. Good morning. I do apologize for these difficulties in communication. It's really frustrating also for me, but I thank you in advance for your understanding. So I represent DG Research and Innovation, and on hydrogen, we have put it as a core priority for our research in energy. So to give maybe a frame, some indications of the frame in which we evolve, we consider that hydrogen is one of the very, very few enablers we have. Looking at the possible technologies, we may have other solutions in a very long run, but currently, and to match the 2030 and 50 objectives, this is electricity and hydrogen. There is no real big solution elsewhere. We don't see hydrogen also as, let's say, an alternative to something else, but as a full enabler. And for that, we have seen in the past many hypes on hydrogen, and then there was a kind of disaffection later on. So what we're trying now is to really boost as much as possible and invest on everything which has to be done for developing a hydrogen economy. My colleagues will surely speak about the coming Hydrogen Alliance, so I will not say anything on that. What I would like to insist on is, first point is this enabler role. So it's critical that we don't look only to hydrogen as an energy for a sector, but we look at hydrogen which can feed a lot of sectors of the economy, for instance, in a standalone region. So this role, I frequently hear, oh, it has to be focused on hard-to-abate sectors, but hydrogen is an enabler, and this has to be kept in mind. The second point is that we are perfectly aware that we need a lot of investment in renewable energy to be able to go for a full clean and green hydrogen. So it's unlikely that we could avoid having blue hydrogen in the next decade, and especially to reach the 2030 climate targets. And what we try to do is to develop both in parallel. We are very reasonably good in the EU for carbon capture and storage, and with blue hydrogen and CCU, these are a very big number of regulatory barriers. One of the main cost domain will be, of course, to set up in Europe the relevant infrastructure, whether it's carriage or storage or production. I mean, this will cost money and will need time for invest. We know it. And one of the challenges which is too often ignored, but to which we really pay attention, is the sustainability and the circularity. It is not because we produce clean or green hydrogen that it is sustainable, because to produce it we need equipment, and these equipment very often lie or use technologies and materials which are not in Europe. And we come back to the issue of the long value chain at worldwide. So this is a concern that we try as research and innovation to systematically integrate. And I begin to be quite known in the Commission for always hammering circularity, please. So what can we do as research and innovation? The first thing is we provide evidence-based for designing regulatory tools. And in hydrogen, it will be extremely important to accelerate the lifting out of regulatory barriers and to do it at European level too. we also provide with a frame for a long-term vision. It's because we usually design things for the next 10 to 30 years. We, of course, develop technologies. And one point I would like to insist is whatever project or technology we do, what is important, really important, even crucial, is to core, this is the cost and the competitiveness of hydrogen. And for that, I very often hear that the solution is scaling up the production of hydrogen or the production of renewable energy. It's not enough. And this is a point where research can very much help, not only in reducing the cost, helping to reduce the cost through innovative technologies for production, but of course, for reducing the losses all along the value chain of hydrogen. Currently, the efficiency of the value chain is very low. It's even lower than for pure electricity. And this is a serious concern, because scaling up, I'm afraid, may not be sufficient to make hydrogen economy enough competitive. It has to be coupled with efficiency of the value chain of hydrogen, with scaling up of the production, of course, and of all the steps. And it has also to be coupled with regulatory frame, which is ensuring a fair competition between fossil energies and green energies. And here also research can help to provide with evidence-based. I think I would like to stop here because I've been quite long, but just finish by mentioning that we intend in the Commission to propose a new partnership on clean hydrogen, and this partnership will be focusing on production, carriage, storage, and some applications, with a priority given to the first point. This is to boost the production and the initiation of an hydrogen economy. I would like to stop here. I do again apologize because I cannot hear your reactions.
Our second speaker is Klaus-Dieter Borchardt, who needs absolutely no introduction at all, so I won't give him one. Klaus-Dieter.
Let me give you my view on the policy options, on the potential, on the bottlenecks, and also on the financing. Let me start with the policy options. Here, I mean, it is very clear that we are all in the Commission with our Green Deal. We are working towards a carbon neutral economy by 2050, and hydrogen has to play its role here. But if it wants to play this role, it is also clear that we will have our emphasis clearly on the renewable-based hydrogen. So the policy option, our first policy option in hydrogen, is clearly to develop renewable-based hydrogen. Having said that, this is a development that will take more than a decade, and all the developments are not clear, and therefore we cannot and we should not exclude at this moment in time other options that we have also with regard to hydrogen, and that is some call it decarbonized hydrogen. I don't like it, but it's hydrogen based on fossil fuels, and here of course I mean natural gas. It's from steam methane reforming together with CCUS. That's or through pyrolysis, as we will hear a bit later from Alex. These are technologies that can also deliver what I would call low carbon hydrogen. But it is clear that from our policy choice, it is second best choice. But in our framework that we have to develop, we have to take care of both. So renewable-based hydrogen and also gas-based hydrogen. The regulatory framework that comes very close to the policy option, in my view, has to concentrate on mainly three aspects. The first is that we need a support framework through state aid and also a taxation regime for scaling up the production. We will further rely on the reduction of CO2 and also on targets and ETS. And the third is that we need maybe sector-specific targets at demand side, not on production side. On demand side, a bit as we have introduced in the RED II on transport. Now, what is the potential that we see? I mean, if we look at the energy system as such, today we have 2% hydrogen in our energy consumption, and only 4% of the production of hydrogen goes into the energy system. So this is very low, and we have to, of course, increase this. How do we do that? Where do we see the potential? First and foremost, I would clearly indicate industrial clusters. We have already today industries, chemical industries, fertilizer industry, now coming a bit green steel industry, etc., where we have already some demand, and in future I think we can cluster it even more with transport, heavy duty, maritime, railways, aviation in terms of synthetic fuels that can be produced from hydrogen as a basis. We will secondly also have to look into along the whole hydrogen value chain, as it was also mentioned by Hélène, what I mentioned. We have nowadays we have these what they called hydrogen valleys, which try to integrate along the whole value chain hydrogen, and that might help us to reduce costs and also develop new business models. So I think that is also something where we can boost the market. And then another very immediate potential I see in coastal areas, especially in ports. We see already now Port of Rotterdam, the Port of Antwerp is following, other ports are also following. This is a huge potential for hydrogen, not only that we can create import and export hubs for hydrogen there, but also within the coastal areas. You can clearly see in the Port of Rotterdam, there's a lot of potential to do that. So industrial clusters, transport, we can look into heating and cooling, but that would require a particular analysis, I would say. I would not tip hydrogen as the first carrier that will go into heating and cooling, but potential is definitely there. But in order to tap into all this potential, we have to remove quite a number of bottlenecks, and I will only mention some, and for me the most important ones. The first I see are the bureaucratic and regulatory hurdles to be taken. So today, for instance, transmission system operators, they don't know whether hydrogen infrastructure goes into the regulated asset base or not. If this is not clear to them, of course, they have quite some difficulties to take long-term decisions. We have absolutely no connections today between power-to-gas installation and the grid. all this does not exist, and we have to do a very broad planning in order to get there. We need to know exactly where the production centers of hydrogen will be and where the consumption centers are, so that we can see where will be the power to X or power to gas installations, and how do we connect them to an existing grid. We are lacking for the moment the definitions of hydrogen and other renewable gases, which is absolutely vital. We cannot continue with our colors. We need to have science-based definitions linked also to the CO2 content over a life cycle. And without that, we cannot install what is necessary also in terms of financing and trade side green certificates that will need to be installed. We have what we have to do is to remove the unfavorable tax treatment that you can see with regard to hydrogen, and also especially for electrolyzers with a double taxation, because electrolyzers are in some member states considered as end consumers, and then they are of course due to pay the levies. So this has to be removed, and we have to facilitate the authorization, licensing, and the connections that are needed. These are more bureaucratic hurdles. So then, of course, and I think Hélène said that already, one of the bottlenecks, of course, are the high costs of production of renewable hydrogen. I start with that. I have here some figures. Nowadays, 1 kilo of hydrogen would cost $4 to $6, and if you compare that with hydrogen coming from natural gas and CCS, there you are at $2.4, and if you do hydrogen from gas without CCS, you are down to $1.7. So even if you take natural gas and CCS and you use that, then you are half at the costs of renewable hydrogen, and that's of course a challenge that we have to tackle. And Hélène has already said Scaleup is one thing, but scaling up only makes sense if we at the same time have also tapped into the potential that I have mentioned, so that we need to address at the same time production and the consumption side. So in other words, we also have to develop the markets actively in parallel to what we are doing with the development of renewable hydrogen. Another bottleneck could be that electrolyzers are needing a lot of electricity. And today we are speaking that electrolyzers can use the so-called excess electricity, avoiding curtailment and compensation for curtailment. All this is fine, but if we are really scaling up, then there will be not enough excess energy available. So these electrolyzers or the companies running it, they have to buy electricity from the market, and that would mean that first we need very high amounts of renewable electricity, and this at a competitive price. Also something that is quite challenging. And a last word on the hydrogen coming from natural gas and CCS. Here I would see two big challenges and bottlenecks. The first, of course, is, I think Hélène mentioned that as well, we need to get CCUS on the ground. We have some promising projects now in Norway. and also, as I said, at smaller scale in the port, notably Port of Rotterdam, which is good. But we really need to establish this technology in the first place. And when we are talking about steam methane reforming from natural gas or pyrolyzers, the question, of course, there is, where does this take place? So I can imagine that we will do this close to our consumption centers. So that means that the whole transport will be still natural gas. And there we have as a big challenge the methane leakage. And this is something that we have to resolve. And we have to resolve that very fast, not only with regard to the future decarbonization of natural gas, but also for the continuous usage for the next 10, 15 years of natural gas as such. And these are, of course, big challenges. And we in the Commission, we are working on some strategies in order to also harmonize and internationalize our approaches to get this methane leakage problem under control in terms of common methodologies for measurements, for reporting, and also for verification. And my last point, funding priorities. Here I can say that not only under the Clean Hydrogen Partnership and all the R&D and R&I innovation funds possibilities are important. We are also working on a special strategic hydrogen investment agenda as part of the European Recovery Action Plan. And this is, of course, a big chance for boosting also production and consumption side, because this recovery plan also looks at the industry side, and here we can use this money, which will be destined to hydrogen, that we can also prepare the markets for the take-up of hydrogen, and at the same time, of course, also helping the scale-up of notably electrolyzers. We will also need to use an existing network, the Hydrogen Energy Network, the HyNet, which also will serve for a good part to coordinate national support measures and European support measures. We will continue with the Clean Hydrogen Partnership under the Horizon Europe, which has worked already in the past, but we will be much more focused. And last but not least, we will bring further actions also under the important projects of common European interest, IPCEI, which will also help us to streamline all the funding that goes into the hydrogen chain, notably with the EPCEI status. We have accelerated procedures in state aid approval, and also it gives accelerated access to funding sources. I would also stop here. I hope that you have more or less understood what I said in the 2/3 of the part, what I was saying, and happy to discuss further. Thank you.
Klaus-Dieter, thank you very much indeed. That was what they call a tour de force. You can hear me, Klaus-Dieter?
Yes, I do.
Great. I just have a couple of questions on the basis of the comments made. And you mentioned in the beginning that the feeling was to give priority to renewable hydrogen above decarbonised or blue or whatever we're going to call it, and that you needed sector-specific targets. Could you explain a little more what are the consequences of the giving priority to renewable hydrogen over decarbonised or blue hydrogen, and a little more about how these sector-specific targets might work.
Yeah, I do my best because, of course, we do not have worked this out yet, as you can imagine. This is all work in progress. The prioritization of renewable-based hydrogen clearly stems from our 2050 target, and that's a policy choice that the Commission has made, and that will be reflected, of course, in some ways in the regulatory framework. And I think the most visible thing might be the support schemes. I think that the support schemes will not be the same for renewable-based hydrogen and hydrogen from SMR plus CCUS. The latter, I think, will definitely grow through the technology, CCUS or pyrolysis, I could say, as well. Although I'm looking forward to what Alex is telling us of this technology. But it will there maybe go also more into the help of combating methane leakage, where we can do something in all this to support this. But I'm not so sure that there will be a long-term support scheme as we might need it for the renewable-based hydrogen. But this is my expectation. It's not neither my conviction nor is it already a kind of established truth. Because, as I said, we are developing this, but all what we are discussing internally makes a clear distinction between the renewable-based hydrogen as a priority and as far as is deemed necessary in future to take in then also hydrogen from SMR plus CCUS or pyrolysis. So this is a given. Now, on the demand side targets, the targets, as I said, today we have something 10%, I think it is, on transport. We could, of course, imagine that you give targets for sector-specific, for green steel industry, for the chemistry, for other or particular transport means for railways, for heavy duty, giving that over time. And this then, of course, can be also supported in one way or the other. So that's the way that I can see targets. I don't see targets at EU level on the production side, because if there are those targets, they can only be national, because I don't see it that Europe-wide we can fix for all 27 member states the same target for taking in hydrogen in whatever form. So in my view that will not work, because we will see the development of hydrogen in different regions in Europe, and therefore European targets on the production side, in my view, are not the right way to go. And the thing that I have not mentioned, targets for blending. Here, I mean, everybody knows I'm very skeptical about blending. It has not yet proven to me that this is something that makes economically sense. It can boost production, I accept that, but if one would go for those targets, then of course it can only be limited in time and can only be for really just kind of kick-off help, but not more. So if we discuss targets, I see it more on the consumption side, on the industry side.
Thank you, Klaus-Dieter. That was enormously illuminating. Thanks so much for being with us here today. So our final commission speaker is Stefaan Vergote, advisor for emission reduction strategies. He's well known to all of us in this area as one of the key evidence-based folks in the commission who's always arguing for a clear factual basis to policy. Stefaan, how does DG Clima see this, and what's the approach in the ETS Innovation Fund?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you all hear me and will continue hearing me during the session. I'll try to give a few points on a couple of elements that are important from the side of DG Clima. It's an area that is actually quite new also from a climate perspective, but one that is crucially important, we think, because when we did back in 2018 our communication on the long-term strategy, where for the first time we tried to make a thorough analysis of what does it mean to go to climate neutrality by 2050, the hydrogen technology pathway was coming out as one of the key pathways to actually be able to almost fully decarbonize your energy, transport and industrial sectors. So the interesting thing was that, as already a couple of speakers said, is that you cannot, electrification is an extremely important pathway, and it's one where we are actually making a lot of headway, but you cannot decarbonize all sectors, and there are a few hard to abate sectors where we think a fuel, and in particular a decarbonized fuel like hydrogen or its derivatives, can play an important role. And it has been mentioned in transport, it is things like heavy duty and long haul applications. In industry, it is high temperature heat or hydrogen as a feedstock, for instance, in the steel industry. Also dispatchable zero carbon electricity when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, it might be a solution. So in many different areas, so it is truly something which is cross-sectoral and therefore fully fits into the concept of sector integration that we are also discussing. When we looked at our figures, it is of course very hard to try to project how the world will look like in 2050. But in terms of the overall figures, in our scenarios that we had in the long-term strategy, we came up with a total demand for hydrogen somewhere in the area of 75 until 150 million tons of oil equivalent in 2050. Plus also some additional demand of derived fuels like e-fuels or synthetic methane or the like. So quite an important part of the energy mix could be for hydrogen-based technologies. The situation today is quite different, and even in our modeling in 2030, we don't see a massive penetration of hydrogen in the short term, let's say in this next decade, but we do see a very rapid acceleration after 2030. So from our perspective, it is extremely important that we work now on hydrogen in order for it to be able to fully be deployed after 2030, and hence we'll need to have all the pieces of the puzzles fit together by that time, and indeed already try to do early deployments in order to have learning by doing, to get economies of scale, etc. A second point I'd like to make is that in terms of the policy that we need to think about, it is probably necessary to think quite comprehensively. People have been mentioning specific instruments like we did for renewables with feed-in tariffs or tenders. You could think like in biofuels, you could think about blending. But probably when you look at the solutions that we need, we are really talking about building a new energy supply chain. So the entire value chain from production until bringing it to consumer, and the end-use technologies at the level of the consumer will need to be taken into account. and we will need much more coordination of these different elements to be able to bring those solutions to market. Today, actually, we have quite a lot of hydrogen production in Europe. 7 million tons of hydrogen are produced every year, but only in 2 industrial sectors, mainly fertilizer industry and refineries. So today we have a lot of expertise with the handling, the safety issues, but we are really talking about building something very different, which is a supply chain across Europe, I would say, and where we need to connect production, infrastructure, and demand-side technologies. And in terms of thinking comprehensively, I think it would be useful to think from the start also in an international setting, not only production in Europe, but if this is going to be a solution, I think also globally in the context of the Paris Agreement and solving the climate problem as a whole, we also need to think internationally in order to kickstart such developments also elsewhere, and indeed potentially import solutions also to Europe if other regions have a competitive advantage. And I think that's important both for blue and for green hydrogen. A third point I would like to make, Dieter had mentioned the cost estimates for different technologies. So I, like Hélène and Dieter, I would like to emphasize that continued focus on hydrogen research and innovation is very important. The figures of green hydrogen, for instance, basically demonstrate what the cost is of renewable electricity itself. So we need to think about research and innovation in terms of hydrogen technologies themselves, but also simply reducing the cost of renewable energy further is extremely important. Or for blue hydrogen, indeed, work further on carbon capture and storage. We have an important joint undertaking in Europe that is, I think, delivering good results. So we believe that we need to continue that effort and perhaps even strengthen it. And also in our Horizon Europe programs, we could think also, or there is discussion ongoing of how different elements like the hydrogen joint undertaking itself can work together with downstream research and innovation, for instance, in the transport sector, or in the energy sector, or in the industrial sector, so that we bring also those solutions to the sectors that actually will need to implement them. From our perspective, in terms of research and innovation, we have the Innovation Fund. As you know, the Innovation Fund under the ETS will get the revenues from the sale of 450 million ETS allowances in the next 10 years. In total, we would expect, based on current market prices, that be approximately 10 billion euros. And these funds can be used in particular for first-of-a-kind demonstration of industrial processes, energy storage, hydrogen solutions, including CCS, so both blue and green hydrogen. So quite a wide area. But I think the unique selling point that we have with the Innovation Fund is that it can make the bridge between first deployment and research in the lab. So it's really trying to bring it from lab to fab. And also what is unique is that you can have really large-scale projects. Traditionally, projects in research and innovation are a few to perhaps a few 10 millions of euros. Here in this sector, in this Innovation Fund, we can really think about large-scale industrial plants. So that brings a new order of magnitude in the possibilities to be able to bring these technologies closer to markets and have some learning by doing and bringing the costs down. A fourth point I'd like to make is on the question of blue versus green. First of all, I'd like to say that it's really important that we, when we are thinking about developing a policy, that we define what we want to promote. We have done that for renewables, where we had a definition of renewables and had guarantees of origins. We have that also in CO2 and cars, where we have a definition of what a zero and low emission vehicle is. And probably we also need a definition, preferably at European level, of what we consider to be clean hydrogen consistent with our long-term strategy. And from our perspective, we are actually open to colors. What counts for us is the greenhouse gas performance. So if we can make a system that certifies based on greenhouse gas performance, and that can certify all technologies in a technology neutral way that are consistent with a strong greenhouse gas performance, then this is the most important element for us. A few more points on the enabling policy framework. One element, of course, that is important is infrastructure, because many applications will depend on the availability of infrastructure. So that is an area where we will need to have a lot of attention, because that, to a large extent, the infrastructure is not there. On the side of the ETS, I would like to mention that today, all hydrogen production in Europe, or all large-scale hydrogen production in Europe, is covered by the ETS. Like I mentioned, we have 7 million tons of hydrogen production in Europe, which are very carbon intensive, because of course they are almost 100% based on methane steam reforming without CCS. So that production emits more than 50 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And the current rules under the ETS mean, because these are sectors, refineries and fertilizers, sectors that are deemed to be exposed to carbon leakage, which receive free allocation based on the benchmarks. Of course, for phase 4, all these elements are under revision. The new benchmarks will have to be defined. And of course, there is also the work on 50 and 55%, where the Commission will come out with a communication in September this year, where we will also need to consider what that means for the ETS and the ETS cap in a 2030 perspective, and what that means for all the rules in the ETS. It is actually quite interesting, because when you think about it, the fertilizer industry and the refinery sector, because you have to separate the hydrogen from the CO2 to be able to use it, is probably the sectors where you would expect the lowest cost of abatement, because the capture and the separation of the CO2 is already happening in the process itself. So it's not an extra step with an extra cost. So it is probably an area where the cost of abatement is quite low, assuming that, of course, you have the CCS infrastructure. But on the other hand, it's also a sector where it's difficult to have extra costs for the industry because of the risk of carbon leakage. One area that got a lot of attention, I think, lately among research institutes and think tanks is the concepts of contracts of difference on the CO2 price, which is an interesting concept because it builds on the ETS. But on the other hand, it could allow, if certain technologies are a bit more expensive in the beginning at the point of early deployment, that could get a somewhat higher guaranteed price of CO2 over a certain period, so that certain technologies, we could have more learning by doing first deployments in view of later stronger ETS prices over time, which could then be a stronger driver for hydrogen. Finally, other points are of course also important in terms of trying to create markets. We could also think about what can we do in the transport sector. Can we create a lead market there, just as there is now a lead market for electric vehicles resulting from CO2 and car standards. So that is, of course, also more in the longer term. But the question of energy taxation, the question of network tariffs, so many issues that we need to look at in order to see how we can create a level playing field for hydrogen next to all the other energy carriers in the energy markets. I leave it at that, and thank you for listening.
Stefaan, thank you very much indeed. That was awesome. Can I just ask the question? You quoted a number of figures regarding the relative costs of green, blue, hydrogen compared to each other and natural gas. And you indicated that your modelling is that we won't need much clean hydrogen until 2030, and thereafter we will need a lot. Is there anywhere that we can access the modelling and figures in this respect?
When we developed the long-term strategy back in 2018, there was quite a long in-depth analysis. So we have it was not which in total was 400 pages, where we had described 8 different decarbonization scenarios. So it was very much an exploratory exercise on what can electrification bring, what can hydrification bring, what can the circular economy bring, etc., and combine those elements in order to get to climate neutrality. So a lot of information can be found there. Another element that I think we should that is useful is that we are in the process of actually, together with DG Energy and DG Move, developing a new reference scenario that will be the basis for our work in the context of new analysis for the Green Deal. And one of the things we have done there is that we have also done a big exercise on asking stakeholders, asking experts about their assumptions and prospects for different technologies, electrification technologies, hydrogen technologies, biomass, biofuel technologies, electrolyzers, and all that. So there is also a big exercise ongoing in terms of technology assumptions that we are using in our modeling, and I guess that will also be made public once that exercise is being done.